Dozens of fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls were just found in a cave.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest of the Old Testament. So they were discovered in 1946 to 1957. So there's a lot going on there, right? So, and some of these, I mean, are so fragmentary that you look at them and it's like confetti, which was a big deal.
2,000 years ago, desert scribes hid treasures in cave walls, the Dead Sea Scrolls. For centuries, scholars debated their secret messages, until now.
We're talking about a corpus of about 1,000 manuscripts that are comprised of thousands and thousands of fragments.
Thanks to cutting-edge AI, combined with DNA profiling and X-ray tomography, we're cracking codes that were once thought lost forever. What we're uncovering isn't just history, it's a potential game changer that could shake the foundations of belief. Some of the most jaw-dropping insights, they're already being broken down on the Joe Rogan Experience, where experts, skeptics, and insiders are unpacking what AI is really uncovering. This isn't your typical ancient tech story. It's a mind-bending journey into truth, technology, and the unknown. Stick with us till the end. The revelations coming out of this could make you question everything you thought you knew. Scroll fever. As Christian apologist and manuscript expert Wesley Huff put it on the Joe Rogan Experience, the Dead Sea Scrolls are like uncovering the raw heartbeat of the oldest Old Testament writings, unedited whispers echoing across 2 millennia. The scrolls are made up of up to 15,000 fragments, scattered remnants that once belonged to some 800 to 900 ancient manuscripts. Museums will move heaven and earth for a genuine Dead Sea Scroll, and archaeologist, biblical scholar, and philologist William F. Albright didn't mince words when he called them the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. But what's all the fuss about? Put simply, these scrolls are a time machine, a library, and a window into worlds we only guessed at before. First off, the Dead Sea Scrolls give us the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible by a mile. Before their discovery, scholars leaned on medieval texts like the Leningrad and Aleppo codices, beautiful manuscripts, but made over 1,000 years after the originals. The Dead Sea Scrolls date back to the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, skimming just centuries after those books were first written. Every book except Esther turned up in at least one fragment. Finding multiple copies of the same book, sometimes with tiny differences, shows that back then, texts weren't locked down. Scribal errors crept in, editors tweaked a phrase here or there, and whole versions of books could differ side by side. That's a thrill for historians and believers alike, because it proves that the Bible we hold today rests on a living, breathing tradition. But here's something most people don't know. Only about 25% of the Dead Sea Scrolls is straight-up biblical text. The other 75%? A wild mix of community rule books, letters, poems, prophecy fragments, legal code, and apocalyptic visions. Some scrolls lay out daily routines and purity laws for a sectarian group, likely the Essenes, while others argue about the end of days or dip into messianic dreams that later hooked into Christian ideas. Then there are letters sent back and forth to temple leaders in Jerusalem, hinting at politics and power struggles that shake our picture of the Second Temple world. Before the scrolls turned up, our view of pre-Christian Judaism came mainly from rabbinic writings like the Mishnah and Talmud, remarkable books, but written centuries after Jesus walked the dusty roads. Those texts paint Judaism in a largely legal and scholarly light. The Dead Sea Scrolls, by contrast, bring us face to face with everyday faith. How groups studied scripture, organized meals, handled disputes, and whispered hopes for a savior. They show ideas flowing across towns and villages, not locked in ivory tower debates. That reshaped how scholars think about the birthplace of both rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. On a side note, these scrolls are a goldmine for language nerds. They're written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and sometimes Greek, giving clues about how those tongues changed over time. The fact that Aramaic pops up so often underlines its role as the go-to language of the day, used by the Qumran community, by Jesus and his followers, and eventually by writers of the New Testament. Every letter form, every dusty ink stain, tells us how people wrote, spoke, and learned to read back then. The non-biblical scrolls offer even richer surprises. Ideas about angels, the afterlife, and purity dance through their lines in ways we never saw in the Hebrew Bible itself. You can spot echoes of these riffs in the Gnostic Gospels and in early Christian letters, lines that sting with similar questions about who's holy, who's chosen, and what the end times will look like. So naturally, early commentators jumped to label the Qumran group proto-Christian, even claiming it was a kind of Jesus-run monastery. Those theories have since dialed down in academic circles, but the idea still fascinates visitors who add Qumran to their pilgrimage lists alongside Bethlehem and Nazareth. So why does the fight over translation and ownership rage on? Part of it is pride. Owning a genuine scroll boosts a museum's reputation and its ticket sales. Part is faith. Religious communities stake their claims on certain readings, eager to find proof for their favorite doctrines. And part is pure scholarly passion. Every minor variant or new fragment can tip the scales in debates about how the Bible grew from scattered writings into the book we know today. Even now, over 70 years after the first jars cracked open, every new discovery or fresh scan wakes up the academic and religious world all over again. The other side of the Dead Sea Scrolls. In one memorable episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson dove into John Allegro's wild take on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Allegro, a daring but controversial member of the Scrolls editorial team, threw everyone for a loop in a British radio broadcast. He claimed that the teacher of righteousness, a mysterious Jewish sect leader mentioned in the Scrolls, was actually a forerunner of Jesus Christ. According to Allegro, this teacher was crucified, and his followers took down the broken body of their master to stand guard over it until Judgment Day, when he would rise again. You can imagine the gasp in the studio. None of the other editors saw any hint of that in the manuscripts. Allegro didn't stop there. He later published The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, arguing that early Christianity was a mushroom-worshipping fertility cult. That left colleagues rolling their eyes, and Aristotelian logic firmly intact. His mushroom theory was so off the wall that it destroyed what little credibility he had among serious scholars. While Allegro was busy chasing psychedelic visions, another storm brewed over the Scrolls publication itself. Access to the Scrolls was tightly controlled by a small team of scholars for decades. Frustration simmered as impatient academics and journalists complained that the treasures were being kept under lock and key. The bottleneck finally snapped in 1991 when the editor-in-chief, John Strugnell, found himself in a firestorm. He'd been quoted in an Israeli paper calling Judaism a horrible religion that ought not to exist. Whether he truly meant it or not, it was a brutal gaffe. Strugnell struggled with alcoholism and bipolar disorder at the time, and many felt he was not in a clear state of mind when he gave that interview. Still, the damage was done. Strugnell had a solid record of working with Israeli scholars. He'd even brought some onto the editorial board, but he had to resign. His departure was bittersweet. It broke the logjam and opened the Scrolls to wider study, but it also reminded everyone how personal flaws in politics can cloud academic work. Even after the Scrolls were finally published in full, controversies didn't evaporate. Scholars still debate the meaning of obscure phrases, the identity of the teacher of righteousness, and the precise links, if any, to early Christianity. Editing these texts is like peeling an onion. Every layer you remove reveals another. But what if the greatest breakthroughs aren't coming from human eyes alone? What if AI and an arsenal of futuristic tools are now stepping in to unlock secrets no one could reach before? Pixels and parchment. Imagine holding a piece of history so fragile that touching it could turn it to dust. Just a few years ago, those brittle fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls seemed forever trapped behind char and decay. Today, a suite of cutting-edge tools, from multispectral cameras to genetic testing, is lifting the veil on these ancient texts. But behind the scenes, it's not just microscopes and imaging tech driving the revolution, it's also algorithms. AI is playing an increasingly central role, helping researchers sift through vast amounts of visual and linguistic data, identifying patterns that no human could spot alone. At the heart of this movement stands the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library Project, housed at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem, where an unparalleled imaging system is breathing new life into every scrap of parchment. First, there's multispectral imagery. By bathing a fragment in 12 different wavelengths, 7 in the visible light range and 5 in the near infrared, incredible data emerges. Ink that vanished against a singed or stained background suddenly reappears. Letter by letter, researchers can see into the very fibers of the parchment, discerning ink that human eyes would miss. Every single fragment, some 15,000 in all, is photographed on both sides under these various lights. The resulting colored images reveal hidden characters, letting scholars tease out words once thought lost forever. Next comes virtual unwrapping. Some scrolls were mangled by fire in the 19th century, others so fragile they'd crumble at the faintest touch. Using X-ray tomography, similar to a medical CT scan, scientists capture thousands of cross-section images and reconstruct a 3D model. Then, with the help of advanced software and increasingly machine learning, those warped scrolls are digitally unfurled into legible text. In 2016, the Engedi scroll, a charred lump barely bigger than a soda can, yielded 35 lines of Leviticus once trapped inside. What was once a puckered, unreadable cylinder is now clearly legible. Then there's 3D printing. By producing exact replicas of these fragile fragments, teams around the world can study every ridge and groove without risking the originals. It's like sending the scrolls on a global tour while the real pieces stay locked away in climate-controlled vaults. Researchers can handle, annotate, and even test these facsimiles, accelerating discoveries at a pace we've never seen before. And with AI constantly learning from each new find, the scrolls may soon tell stories we didn't even know were buried in the dust. Most recently, genetic sleuthing entered the stage. In June 2020, a team published mitochondrial DNA analysis of parchment from 26 fragments. By isolating tiny traces of human handling from animal DNA, they traced the geographic origins of the skins used, sheep, goats, or cows from regions well beyond Qumran. Some parchments match animal lineages from different parts of Judea or even farther afield, proving these texts traveled long routes before settling in the desert caves. While DNA can't tell us who scribed the text, it clusters fragments by shared animal origin, refining how we piece together scattered scraps. This paleogenomic approach has led to surprising corrections. 2 fragments of Jeremiah, once thought to belong together, turned out to come from different animals. 1 cow, 1 goat, meaning they sprang from separate workshops. By grouping fragments based on their genetic fingerprints, scholars can now assemble texts more accurately than with handwriting style or carbon dating alone. All of this work happens under the watchful eye of the Israel Antiquities Authority's imaging facility, the miracle spot where Wesley Huff might say, "We're hearing the raw heartbeat of the oldest Old Testament writings." This system, part high-tech lab, part digital museum, captures not just images, but metadata. Every wavelength, every angle, every pixel, coordinates logged for posterity. The goal is twofold: preserve the scrolls under the strictest conditions and open them up online to everyone. Once uploaded to a dedicated website and linked through Google, these treasures become a brave new world for scholars and the public alike. Spectral imaging does more than reveal hidden text. It serves as an ongoing monitor, watching for changes in the fragments over time. NASA-developed techniques help ensure that the images remain consistent, so any new fading or cracking shows up immediately. Scholars can compare images year by year, tracking the scroll's stability as rigorously as they track discoveries. Why does it all matter? Each new line uncovered by multispectral shots deepens our grasp of ancient prayers and laws. Every virtual unwrap feeds fresh entries into our catalog of known texts. Every DNA match redraws the map of scroll networks, revealing that writings once thought isolated to a sectarian group actually reflect wider theological currents. While technology has shed fresh light on Qumran and its era, there are still big gaps in what we actually know. Now, with the introduction of DNA testing, researchers have a powerful new tool, not just for studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, but for unlocking secrets buried in ancient texts and archaeological finds across the board. This could change the game for scholars worldwide. Scrolls versus Scripture. The Dead Sea Scrolls pose a big question. Do they contradict the Bible, or do they prove it? It's a question that matters to anyone who holds the Bible as sacred, and to anyone simply curious about how this ancient text took shape. The answer isn't cut and dried, but rather a winding story of scribes, copyists, and evolving traditions. And it all starts with which books turned up in those desert caves. Almost every book of the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament shows up among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The biggest haul came from Isaiah, the Psalms, and the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. You'll find dozens of copies or fragments of those texts. By contrast, some books never made it into the caves. 1 Chronicles, Nehemiah, and Esther don't turn up in any complete fragment. A stray piece of 2 Chronicles survives, and bits of Ezra mingle with parts of Nehemiah in some traditions. But Esther, it's nowhere to be found, though a few Qumran writings hint at its story. Among the so-called Apocrypha, only Tobit, Sirach, also called Ecclesiasticus, and the Epistle of Jeremiah appear. All in all, the community seemed focused on what we consider the core Hebrew Bible, while most apocryphal works stayed off their shelves. Back then, there were no complete Bibles as we know them. Each book rode on its own scroll, and no list tells us which of those scrolls the Qumran people saw as sacred. Scholars peek at how often a book appears or how it's quoted in other Qumran texts to guess which writings really mattered. By those measures, books like 1st Enoch and Jubilees also held pride of place. Some experts argue they were treated almost like scripture, but others warn that, without a definitive canon list, we can only guess at the scroll community's internal top 10. Beyond the question of which books were kept, the scrolls offer a peek into how those texts were copied and fine-tuned. Some of the scroll versions match almost letter for letter with the medieval Hebrew manuscripts that later Jewish scholars called the Masorets passed down. That match shows an astonishing level of care in copying over centuries. Yet other scrolls carry variations, small slips by scribes or deliberate edits meant to tidy up confusing passages. Wherever differences appear, scholars argue over which reading came first and which change crept in later. On top of copy-by-copy tweaks, a few scrolls hint at entirely different editions of the same book. The best-known case is Jeremiah. One fragment, known as 4Q Jera, reads just like the medieval text in our modern Bibles. But 2 others, 4 Jerb and 4Q Jerd, follow a shorter version that lines up with the ancient Greek translation of Jeremiah. That Greek text juggles chapters, putting the oracles against foreign nations in a new spot, and trims some material. Many researchers think the shorter edition is older, and that the longer Hebrew text was expanded later. If that's right, the Dead Sea Scrolls give us a rare window into how a single book could shift shape before settling into its final form. So do the scrolls knock the Bible off its pedestal? Far from it. When scrolls match our current text exactly, they show that the words handed down were steadier than we might have guessed. When scrolls vary, they remind us that the Bible we read today didn't spring fully formed. It grew in layers, through debates, errors, and thoughtful edits. Those variations aren't embarrassing missteps so much as signposts of a living tradition, where scribes and scholars wrestled with how best to preserve ancient words. For believers, the scrolls can feel like both a challenge and a confirmation. On one hand, finding ancient copies that mirror modern Bibles can bolster confidence that the text you hold in your hand traces back safely 2,000 years. On the other hand, seeing variant readings invites questions. Which version counts as the Bible? How do we decide that one phrase is original and another is a later gloss? Those are questions theologians and scholars continue to hash out in lecture halls and study groups around the world. Now it's time for today's subscriber pick. AI has already done some pretty amazing things with the Dead Sea Scrolls, those ancient, fragile texts that sat in silence for centuries. Using machine learning, scientists can now piece together torn fragments, fill in missing letters, and even guess smudged words with almost spooky accuracy. Powerful tools like OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Bard, Anthropic's Claude, Meta's LLama, and others like Transcribus are helping decode damaged scrolls, match up old languages, and offer fresh translations in just seconds. But even with all this power, AI still struggles with the deeper stuff, like poetry, cultural references, and the tricky meanings hidden in ancient Hebrew phrases. These tools can offer solid guesses, but they can't yet tell which expert theory is more accurate or pick up on subtle symbols buried in the text. But AI is evolving fast. It's getting smarter, better at understanding context, and more tuned into history. Soon, translating ancient texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls might be as easy as clicking a button. And the secrets they reveal could just have us saying, AI just translated the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the truth is disturbing. Authorship in the shadows. Everyone agrees that the Dead Sea Scrolls are genuine, but the real puzzle is who penned them. Over the decades, scholars have offered a handful of theories, each with its own strengths and blind spots, and the mystery only deepens the more we learn. Roland Deveau, a French archaeologist leading digs at Qumran from 1952 to 1957, was one of the first to propose an answer. He noticed that the site was littered with mikvaot, ritual bathing pools that held fresh rainwater, each big enough to immerse a person. Deveau pointed out that Flavius Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, described the Essenes as a community of men who wore white linen garments, shared everything in common, and bathed at fixed hours. Sure enough, Deveu's team found at least a dozen of those pools around the settlement, which held about 85 gallons each. It seemed too neat to be a coincidence. The white shifts, the daily dips, the communal rooms, it all fit Josephus's Essenes. From that, Deveau concluded the Essenes must have lived at Qumran and written the scrolls stored in the nearby caves. Yet even the Essene explanation has holes. For one thing, ritual immersion was hardly unique to that group. Many devout Jews used mikvah to stay ritually pure. Philo, another Jewish writer from around the same era as Josephus, described Essenes living in towns and villages, not tucked away in a desert fortress. Archaeologists point out that only 11 scroll fragments were found right by the ruins, while nearly 1,000 pieces were scattered across 11 caves in a wider area. If a small religious sect were copying texts day in and day out, why hide nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible in caves miles apart? Something about scale doesn't add up, and scholars began to look elsewhere for answers. In 1960, German theologian Karl Heinrich Rengstorff offered a compelling alternative: a grand library in Jerusalem. He argued that the temple, the hub of Jewish life, must have housed a vast collection of sacred writings cared for by professional scribes. That theory explains why the scrolls include texts from Genesis to Chronicles and beyond, far too many to be the work of a handful of desert-dwelling Essenes. When Roman legions under General Titus tightened their grip on Jerusalem around 70 AD, someone would have hauled these treasures south to safety, perhaps stashing them in the caves until calmer times returned. American historian Norman Golb took Rengstorff's idea even further. He imagined not just one library, but several in Jerusalem and elsewhere. Hidden collections in synagogues, private homes, maybe even administrative offices, each filled with scrolls. As word of the Roman advance spread, caretakers could have rushed to protect those texts, loading them into clay jars and hauling them across the desert to the caves by Qumran. This scenario fits some surprising finds. Coins, pottery, and tools from the siege era have turned up in old sewer tunnels beneath Jerusalem, which lead down toward the Kidron Valley, within a few days' walk of the Dead Sea. Could some scrolls have slipped through those underground passages en route to the caves? It's a vivid image, sacred manuscripts creeping along damp stone corridors as the fight for the city raged above. Recent breakthroughs in technology have added more twists. In 2021, researchers at the University of Groningen used artificial intelligence to analyze handwriting on the Great Isaiah Scroll. They detected subtle variations in pen strokes, ink flow, and letter formation, signatures that point to multiple scribes working on a single manuscript. The same kind of handwriting detective work shows up in other scrolls, where shifts in Hebrew style or even snippets of Greek and Nabatean pop up. That kind of diversity suggests a team of professional copyists rather than a small desert sect with one quill between them. Still, none of these theories gives a perfect fit. Why are there duplicate scrolls of certain books? If the scrolls came from a single library, you might expect one copy of each text, not two or three. On the other hand, why would elite scribes send their manuscripts to a windswept outpost with no clear library infrastructure of its own? Some scholars now propose a middle ground. Perhaps the Essenes wrote certain community-specific texts, rules, hymns, and prayers. while more formal biblical scrolls came from Jerusalem's professional scribes. Over time, the Qumran community could have gathered scrolls from multiple sources, creating a kind of hybrid collection that reflected both local beliefs and wider Jewish traditions. The true story might combine pieces of every theory. Imagine a group of Essenes living at Qumran, copying their own regulations and commentaries. Meanwhile, texts from Jerusalem's libraries arrived in jars, escorted through tunnels or by camel train. As archaeologists turn up new fragments and AI gets smarter, we inch closer to understanding who held the quills. Yet every fresh clue seems to raise as many questions as it answers. Scrolls in the crossfire. As of today, the Israeli government owns the Dead Sea Scrolls, yet Jordan and the Palestine National Authority both challenge Israel's claim, turning these ancient manuscripts into a modern political hot potato. Right now, the scrolls rest behind secure glass at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. But that wasn't always the case. In the 1950s, they were housed and studied in what was then called the Palestinian Archaeological Museum, today known as the Rockefeller Archaeological Museum. When Israel captured East Jerusalem in the 1967 Six-Day War, the scrolls changed hands. Jordan insists they were taken illegally during that conflict, and they still push for their return whenever the scrolls go on tour abroad. Jordan's argument goes like this. The West Bank and East Jerusalem were under Jordanian control from 1948 to 1967. During that period, Jordan managed archaeological sites and cultural treasures, including the scrolls. When Israel seized those territories, Jordan lost any legal right to hold or loan out the manuscripts. Today, whenever the scrolls display in Paris, Seoul, or New York, Jordan demands they be sent back to Ammon, not Jerusalem. The Palestine National Authority echoes this stance, calling the scrolls removed from Palestinian territories and demanding their return. From Ramallah's perspective, the scrolls belong to the land now claimed by the state of Palestine. As artifacts unearthed in caves that lie within the Palestinian sphere, the PNA argues that they should be repatriated to Palestinian institutions. Israel's response is firm. Jordan never had a rightful claim to the scrolls in the first place. According to Israeli law and international agreements, Israel is the sovereign custodian of Jerusalem and its treasures. Nina Shore of the Israeli Antiquities Authority sums it up neatly. We are the custodians of the Dead Sea Scrolls. As such, we have a right to exhibit them and to conserve them. Under Israeli care, the scrolls receive climate-controlled storage, expert conservation, and top-tier security. So far, foreign governments have complied with Israel's ownership.
We usually keep the scrolls in a very strict climate-controlled atmosphere.
When scrolls return from exhibitions in Europe, Asia, or the Americas, they head straight back to the Israel Museum. No major museum has defied Israel's claim, at least not openly. Beyond politics, the scrolls are now more accessible than ever. Scholars no longer need secret passwords or closed-door privileges. Anyone with internet access can dive into high-resolution images via the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library, thanks to a partnership between Google and the IAA. That digital archive lets you zoom into the tiniest cracks and ink blots, revealing details you'd miss with the naked eye. On the museum side, the scrolls travel sparingly, but they do tour. Thanks to loan agreements that recognize Israel's custodianship, exhibitions pop up in cities worldwide. Visitors marvel at the faded Hebrew letters and wonder at the silent stories etched on leather and papyrus. In classrooms and online forums, students and history buffs debate not just who owns the scrolls, but what they reveal about ancient Judaism, early Christianity, and the tangled roots of Western religion. Those debates now include voices from across the globe. Scholars in Amman, Ramallah, Tel Aviv, Paris, and beyond. In the end, the Dead Sea Scrolls remain as powerful today as they were 2,000 years ago. They speak of faith, law, community, and now modern claims of ownership and cultural heritage. Whether locked in vaults under Jerusalem's Old City or streamed on laptops around the world, the scrolls continue to stir our imaginations and our politics, proving that some ancient treasures can never truly rest.